Hi, this is Jeremy Allison at Google, and I'm very happy to be here with Jim Zemlin from the Linux Foundation. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
Oh. So, can you tell some of our viewers who are the Linux Foundation, what do you do, and, what's your job?
The Linux Foundation is the organization that's responsible for sponsoring primarily the work of Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux and our most well-known staff member. And what that encompasses is basically setting up an infrastructure so that the Linux kernel development process goes smoothly. And when I say smoothly, that means that the physical infrastructure to enable that development exists and is well taken care of, maintained, and secure, that the people who are core to that process have a neutral place that they can go about doing their work, and also so that we can protect the platform from any threats, whether they be legal threats or threats in terms of financial support or technical cooperation from the industry. And so far, the organization's been successful in ferrying along with the support of thousands and thousands of people all over the world, the process that surrounds Linux.
So, let me get this straight. You're actually Linus Torvalds' boss. So can you say, sort of, Linus, this sucks, go fix this bug.
I'm about as much
eat
his
a bug,
boss. Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm about as much his boss as I am the boss of my wife, which means very, very little. I sign his paycheck. I make sure that he has a paycheck. I make sure that he, everything that he doesn't want to deal with, so anything that's non-technical, anything that's not related to developing the kernel, I make sure is taken care of so that he has a place that he can do what he does, which is, really act as the center of the largest collaborative software development project in the world. So that's, if that means being a boss, I guess that's true, but I wouldn't really describe it that way, and I know for sure that Linus would not describe it that way either.
Yeah, that's probably true. So who funds the Linux Foundation? Okay, I'll stand up and say I know that we do.
Google definitely, yeah. Google is a large.
So who else is in there, and what kind of members do you have?
So really, it's anybody who has a financial stake in using Linux to provide products or services, or people that just care about a level playing field when it comes to core software, in particular operating system software that runs, these days almost everything we touch on a daily basis. So it's companies like Google that uses Linux to create your core search product. So Google itself, Google.com, runs on Linux. Android uses Linux to produce wonderful phones all over the world. Companies like IBM have a tremendous business selling hardware and services with Linux. Intel sells a lot of chips that run Linux. NEC, Fujitsu, Hitachi, Oracle, Qualcomm, Nokia. It's really everybody but Microsoft at this point.
So you're kind of a collective that actually works rather than the usual ones that kind of stand up and then fall down a few months later.
Yeah. I mean, our organization exists as a nonprofit, and we're primarily concerned with the development of the core Linux kernel and the surrounding projects of Linux, and making sure that that's freely available to everyone to use. That's not to say that we're not enthusiastic about the hundreds and thousands of companies that use Linux to make money. Google uses it to make money, and IBM does, and so forth. And we think that's a great thing. And we're equally enthusiastic about projects that use Linux to help their fellow mankind. Things like the One Laptop Per Child project, which is a terrific project out there that helps children get access to technology at a very low cost. So we're sort of at the center of all these different economies, and the companies and people that believe in this and benefit from it are kind enough to give us a very, very small, tiny...
Could be more, right? Always could be more.
Always could be more. But, we've never had a hard time in showing the value of what we do, and so that speaks to Google's generosity towards the Linux Foundation, and to hundreds
of us too.
to hundreds of companies around the world.
So For people who don't know, Jim is probably one of the most spectacular public speakers I've ever seen. When he stands up at the Linux Foundation events. Excuse me, and if you can get the chance, I would heartily recommend going along to a Linux Foundation event, just so you can hear Jim do his speech. And I'll tell you something, if you were selling timeshares, everybody in that room would come out of that
Thank
conference
you.
with a timeshare. I mean, it's
We like to call it vacation ownership. That's
timeshare is kind of
Yeah,
a negative connotation.
exactly.
But so one of the really inspiring things about that talk you give that maybe you could give our viewers an example of is you actually have. I mean, Linux is an interesting thing, but you actually have a vision of it that really. You know, and you use an example, the Microsoft original mission statement, and you have a mission statement and a vision for Linux, which I think is probably the most inspiring thing I've ever heard.
Yeah,
Maybe
so
you could do some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that everything needs a vision. The cool thing about Linux is that the vision is constantly changing because the community is self-forming and consistently creating a new idea about just how far you can take this type of collective development effort. And you know, I like to draw an analogy to the vision that Bill Gates had when he first started Microsoft, which was really simple, which was to have a PC on every desktop running Windows software. It was simple, it was compelling, it was meaningful, and it changed history.
Understandable for everybody.
Yeah. And Linux vision started as an idea of getting people to collectively work on software, that no single person's idea was important. It was, you know, sort of all of our ideas collectively that really made for incredible innovation. And what that's translated into is a vision of not Linux on every desktop, you know, on every person's computer, but really Linux everywhere. And when I say Linux everywhere, I mean literally everywhere. That there isn't a single person in modern society, in that world, that doesn't touch and use Linux every single day, no matter who you are. And, you know, I can give you hundreds of examples, but I'll just give you a few. You know, you might wake up in the morning and turn on your digital video recorder or smart television, and that's 99% of the time Linux.
Televisions run Linux, which amazes me, but is
And then you might
true.
listen to music on, you know, a streaming music service, and those are almost all Linux. You'll surf the internet. You'll do a Google search. That runs Linux. You'll log onto your Facebook account. That runs Linux. You'll, you know, go check your bank balance. That your bank is running a Linux operating system on most of their websites. You'll maybe trade some stocks through your bank. I think something like 75% of all equities in the world are traded on Linux platforms. The New York Stock Exchange, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, all of these run Linux. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange. We're talking about trillions of dollars in transactions that happen every year on Linux. You make a phone call on your Android cell phone, that's Linux. You might, you know, check something on your desktop. In many cases these days, those are now becoming increasingly Linux. You might drive in your car, and automotive systems are now being built. The navigation systems are running Linux. Right. So, I mean, you literally can't avoid it. You withdraw money from an ATM, that's Linux. You go to check out at a cash register, that's going to be Linux. You get on a train, the train systems are running Linux. Air traffic control systems all over the world are running Linux. So I would go so far as to say is not only has the vision of Linux everywhere been fulfilled and is growing every day, but in the case of navigation systems and air traffic control systems, your life is literally in our hands.
That's kind of a scary thought, knowing Linus.
I take
in the hands of the
comfort.
guy with the penguin.
I take comfort in that.
I remember being on an airplane and seeing the entertainment system booting up, and you know, the penguin came up on the screen as the entertainment system. It really does seem to be turning up everywhere. So is this the year of the Linux desktop?
Yeah, well, I think that you'd find a lot of people, including investors, would argue that the desktop no longer matters. I mean, I just did a graph that showed the 10-year stock price of Microsoft stock. And I compared that to the 10-year stock price of Red Hat stock. And it might interest you, in 10 years, in a decade, Microsoft's stock has not gone up at all. In fact, it's gone down about 3-4%, depending on where the market is today.
Yeah.
While Red Hat stock, a purely open source software company, that everything they do is released under open source, their stock price has gone up 400% in a decade. And what that shows is that, the desktop may not really matter that much. What's more mattering is, the ability to have a new type of way of delivering software that's more responsive to customer needs. And increasingly, people are accessing things, over cell phones and tablets and other form factors than the desktop, and those are, in most cases, Linux.
So we lose on the desktop, but we kind of sidestep it.
I think the desktop isn't over yet. I'm not gonna cede that battle yet, because what is interesting is that, let's say this is the year of the tablet for Linux, or this is the year, definitively with Android, this is the year of the mobile phone for Linux. I think it's now number one in smartphone market share across the world. But what that means to the desktop is that all of the driver support, all of the chip support, everything you need to make a desktop these days is now rock solid. Applications are now available. And so I think that you'll see the Linux desktop actually really making meaningful gains over
and
the
all
next
those
few
peripherals
years.
end up getting fixed, because those phones have to be able to print, they have to be able to do, be able to send data places, they have to be able to communicate with all sorts of other things.
Again, if you look at the history of Linux, every market that Linux has started to enter, it has dominated, with the exception of the desktop, which again, I'm not giving up on. But, 10 years ago, high-performance computing was almost exclusively a Linux game. Today, Linux represents
a Unix game, you mean?
Unix game. Now, today, Linux represents over 95% market share, I think, in the top 500 supercomputers in the world. It owns supercomputing. Embedded systems, number one market share. It's displaced, several years ago, displaced VxWorks as the number one embedded systems operating system. Mobile devices, Android again, is dominating the marketplace. And so I really see the desktop as the last remaining battleground for Linux, and I'm not going to cede that that marketplace yet.
You really do mean Linux everywhere, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. And, I think the only reason that Linux struggles in the desktop is because the Exchange server and Microsoft Office represent some key applications to most desktop users. And I think those products are mattering less and less over time as more people switch to things like Gmail, and most people, use things like Google Docs or other Office productivity tools that are equally good to Microsoft Office, notably OpenOffice or LibreOffice or any of the many open source Office productivity suites that are out there.
Yeah, it's my feeling is that essentially tablets are a game changer. I've played with tablets, and once, and you have to give credit for Apple to this, not Linux based, but you really do have to give credit for them.
Apple's been Linux's best friend.
I guess. That form factor, once you start to use it, you realize that it's the computer that everybody wants to use. Now, don't get me wrong, I will still be using a desktop for the indefinite future, but I do a lot of typing. I write code for a living. I sit there and I, debug code. I have Windows, lots of terminal windows open and do things. But when I'm sitting down and I'm just surfing the web, a tablet is, it's so superior.
Yeah.
It's even better than a netbook form factor or anything like that. It's the computer that, anybody's parents would use, I think.
Absolutely. And, again, what tablets have done, and Apple has done a terrific job breaking that market open.
Yeah.
But what it's done for Linux is it's reduced the importance of the traditional desktop market, which was dominated by Microsoft, and put emphasis on new ways of accessing information, which really benefits Linux. Because if you look at products that are out in the market, rumor has it HP is going to be announcing a Linux-based tablet. next
don't
week.
they have WebOS?
They do, but I mean, they haven't formally announced any products
okay.
yet. But rumor has it that they're going to be bringing out a Linux-based tablet. Obviously, Google with Honeycomb is providing
it's
tablet operating system. The Migo project also has tablets in its roadmap, and so you look at all of the dominant tablet platforms that are out there today, with the exception of iOS, they're all Linux.
Yeah.
So that's a great thing for the Linux movement.
So let's talk about some potential problems. If Linux is everywhere and everything's open source, it all seems great, but there's still the Linux license is GPL v2, and that allows people to build in DRM, digital rights management, digital restrictions management. That allows that to be built into a platform, and you end up with something like, well, I mean, let's be honest, like the iPad, where you don't kind of own the hardware. It comes up, it wants to be connected to iTunes. Yeah. It's got a lot of restrictions on what you can do with it.
Yeah.
Aren't you worried about sort of Linux allowing that to happen, and kind of gaining freedom with one hand with the source code and losing it in the other with DRM?
Yeah. So I'll start by describing another historical criticism that people have had of Linux, and then I'll come back to the DRM issue.
Yeah.
I used to hear from people all the time complaints about how people would consume Linux to make a product or to run their network switches or whatever, and would never give back to the community. And in fact, I used to listen to a lot of people, particularly people who I really respect in the open source community, sort of lecture these folks for, you're not giving back enough and so forth. And at a certain point, I finally realized that I didn't care whether these guys gave back. But let me tell you why. Because they always do. History has shown that over time, if you start using open source software for any meaningful product or service that you deliver, you realize over time that you have to give back changes that you make, things that you do with it, because the whole reason you used it is to take advantage of the collective innovation that's happening. And so I think that was something that people were very concerned about early in open source, that people were consuming code and not giving it back. And I think that concern has proved to be not that significant. My experience has been that companies who you never thought would be contributors to the Linux kernel or open source projects are in fact giving back quite a bit. Excuse me. We'll edit this out. So the second question around DRM, though, is an interesting one in that I suspect that the market will, by and large, solve the DRM problem in terms of, I think that people aren't easily duped that ownership of content is important to people, and where it's not important, they sort of cede that ownership to third parties. If having your own copies of, let's say, your music and the ability to back them up in a legitimate way is important to you, I think you go out and you seek DRM-free music, which is available on, I'll use you mentioned the iPad, but I'll mention that iTunes has
that music is DRM-free.
And that was a market mechanism, I assure you.
Yeah,
people wanted it, and they were willing to pay for it, and they did it. And if people want to have access to 10 million songs on a subscription basis, and they don't really own that, but they get this massive library of music on a monthly basis by paying a service fee, they'll cede that ownership. It's kind of a personal choice. But I think that the market is a fairly effective anti-DRM mechanism. And that what you see in DRM is sort of an industry that has a pre-existing business model that they were concerned about, trying to sort of cling to that model. And they may find that when they're focusing over here at on DRM, that the whole industry has moved more towards a subscription-based services model, and DRM is maybe not as important anymore. So, whether that should be something that's incorporated into the licenses of every open source project really, first of all, isn't a good question for me, because we're a huge believer at the Linux Foundation in license and choice being that of the developers.
Yeah, that's... what was it, Linus's law? Whoever writes the code gets to choose the license.
Yeah, and so, I mean, the GPL is clearly a license that the kernel community believes in, and the Apache guys, chose their own license, and for whatever reason that they had at the time. And so what we really want to see is people making source code available because they want to, because it's in their business interest, because it's in the interest of rapid innovation. And that has turned out to be true. Let me put it to you in a different way. I talked to a company that's a big consumer electronics company. Well, I won't say who it is, but they're big.
Yeah.
And they said, we face two huge problems in our industry, two big problems. Apple was not one of the problems they mentioned. And it wasn't Apple.
Yeah.
But the two big problems are these. One, software is a much more important part of the consumer electronics experience. And software is a lot more complicated than it used to be. I'm not just making a call on my cell phone, I'm checking my email, I'm streaming video, I'm doing all sorts of things on it, and it costs a lot more money to build a consumer device these days because the consumer requirements are a very sophisticated software experience. So the first thing that they're faced with is this huge increase in cost to develop consumer electronics. Second problem they have is consumer electronics are basically obsolete in 12 to 18 months. Yeah. I mean, here in Silicon Valley, I think like 6 months, right? And you probably get a new phone every year or so.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and what that means is they have less time to make money, right? Because they can only sell it for a short period of time. So it costs more to make your stuff, and you have less opportunity to make money on it. And so that's the reason they turn to open source, because they can share the development. They can use Linux to create a device faster, cheaper, and it's more innovative because they're sharing ideas with the rest of their competitors even. And they're able to provide services on top of that Linux operating system because they own it, right? It's freely available to them. So they don't have to go to Apple to create their own app store or music service or whatever they want to do. They can have their own. So they get
that's where the value moves.
They get extra revenue there, and they lower their costs at the same time.
Right.
The license itself was a really convenient mechanism to enable that type of innovation. And that's where the brilliance of the GPL comes in, right? In that it's such a good mechanism to keep everybody honest and to do that kind of collaborative development. And so I think that Richard Stallman, in coming up with that, was just a genius, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just a compelling new idea.
Jiu-jitsu on copyright, basically.
Right, and it was such a compelling idea that it has lasted this long period of time. And so I think that fundamentally is good, and I think, the DRM stuff is just, it's a developer choice, and it's probably something that the market will solve itself.
So do you think it's possible or desirable to develop your own operating system these days? Or do you think Linux is just going to become this common platform that everybody bases things on and uses to leverage themselves up into different areas to make money?
It's looking more like the former rather than the latter. It's looking more like people will leverage Linux than create their own operating system. Now, there may be some really compelling technical reasons to go create some new kind of operating system to do something that you really was very specific to what you were trying to accomplish technically. I could go into detail about that, but I think it doesn't matter so much as looking at the other case of leveraging pre-existing technology. We measured what it would take to rewrite Linux. We went and we used a method, I think it's called the Kokomo method of measuring, kind of like a Beach Boys song type of methodology, but it basically measures lines of source code and I think I'm getting that acronym wrong, but it measures lines of source code and ascribes a value to those based on sort of industry practices, the cost of building source code. To rewrite Linux would cost $10 billion.
Wow.
Nobody's going to go...
Nobody has that money.
Well, Microsoft has that money.
But
Apple
can you imagine what the
money.
shareholders would do if they said, hang on a minute, we're going to spend $10 billion?
Right. I mean, I think it doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah.
You know, and Apple and Microsoft, clearly they have that money, and they've come from that world, and so they already had pre-existing technology they could leverage. Although I would note that Apple actually used an open source operating system.
Yeah,
BSD,
that's true. They were FreeBSD.
and so really it was only Microsoft that did it on their own. And why would you go reinvent that wheel? But here's the other thing to keep in mind in terms about why you would not want to go create your own operating system if you were a company making almost anything these days, which is operating systems tend to last for a very, very long time. And the reason that they last for a long time is you create this entire ecosystem around them. And you have to understand how somebody might make a device. They have to go out and they get a chip, they put together, you know, storage and a screen and all of these components and device components that would be used to create whatever they're creating. And they need to have software support for those particular devices. Yeah. And if it doesn't exist, if you're creating your own operating system, you have to create that for everything.
Yeah.
It's
the network effect is just
exactly
almost insurmountable.
And if you look at the network effect, in particularly in the last few years around Linux, every major chip vendor not only supports Linux, but they basically bring those chips up for the first time, they prototype them, they demo them, all with Linux. It's the native environment for most of these core elements of computing. Every device driver is already covered. You can walk, you know, you go to southern China and walk down the halls of Shenzhen and some of these markets where you can basically get any component to build anything you want, and all of that stuff is supported with Linux. So you have this tremendous economy that's supporting Linux in almost every form of computing that there is out there, which is just remarkable. And I would go even so far as to say Linux is the first platform that has jumped from one category of computing to another. And what I mean by that is, you know, it's number one in embedded systems, very small devices, but it's also number one in high-performance computing.
Yeah, that's an incredible range, and it's the same code.
It's the exact same code.
No one's ever done that before.
But here's the here's the unintended consequence of that, which is the number one cost for high-performance computing. It's not the hardware, and it ain't the software. It's the power and cooling of, you know, these data centers. That's why I think Google is putting these data centers in Eastern Oregon.
Yeah, near hydropower.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the funny thing is that industry wasn't typically focused on power consumption, right? They were focused on performance because of high-performance computing. But when the device industry, the embedded systems and phone guys started getting interested in Linux and using it, they were really focused on power management.
Yeah, they drove the power down because they've got tiny little batteries in small space.
Exactly. So the code that came in from the phone guys and from the embedded systems guys actually benefited the high-performance computing guys.
That's really cool. I hadn't thought about that before.
And that just, again, shows you why you wouldn't do this stuff from scratch, because you would forego all of the benefits across all of these different forms of computing and that huge network effect that's already going on with Linux. And so I would say that we're not at a point where Linux is dominant completely in every form of computing or everywhere. I think we're at the beginning of an even stronger run for 20, 30, 40, 50 years where Linux will really be this fundamental part of almost every aspect of computing. We'll get stronger.
It's just a building block, in other words. It's
absolutely
the standard brick that you build things out of.
Right. And what's interesting is that Linux has been able to, because it's a self-forming community, jump from different segment of computing to segment of computing and be able to embrace new forms of computing better than any other platform in the history of computing, where it's, you know, what doesn't matter what the chip architecture is or what the characteristics of the particular devices are. Linux has adapted itself incredibly well to all of those forms of computing.
So I remember meeting Linus around 2000 in Australia. We had a bet, actually, that I think it was by, I can't remember the exact date, maybe somewhere around 2020, that the version of Windows shipping at that point would be Linux-based. We're kind of halfway there. How do you think we're doing? I must admit,
we're not doing well.
When I meet Microsoft engineers, and I meet them socially occasionally, and I always just kind of say to them, "Oh, you have to write all your own code, man. That must take that must be really hard.
Actually, it's worse. It's worse than that, Jeremy, because one of the advantages of Linux is across all these forms of computing, there is a single kernel.
Yeah.
And Microsoft actually supports, I think, 4 different kernels. They have the NT kernel, the desktop kernel, that's in Windows 7. They have the Windows Phone 7 kernel, and they have Windows CE. Those are all separate. Those are separate projects. They have to separately do a lot of the engineering work around that. And that's just an incredible
That's a lot of work. Yeah.
It is. In fact, I talked to some investors who asked me, one of the things that Microsoft really touts to them is the fact that they have this huge number of people who make sure that all the device driver support and all of this works very, very effectively across all of Microsoft's product line. In fact, they have thousands of people who are doing this, and it's an unbelievable effort.
Yeah.
And my retort was, we have a few hundred volunteers who do all of that for free.
Greg Crow-Hartman actually seems to be most of them.
and in a highly effective way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, everyone who's doing devices who wants it to work with consumer electronics, they do the work for free because they have to. I mean, they have to make that work with the Linux kernel.
Yeah, but it's in their business interest, because then they can sell their products to all of the different companies that are part of this humongous ecosystem around the Linux operating system.
So, let's switch gears a bit. How did you get to be the CEO of the Linux Foundation? I mean, where do you come from? What's your background?
I was the last man standing. It was. So one of the,
you killed all the other opponents.
No,
in the ring.
It's more like it's in a room, and who's going to do that, and everyone's kind of looking at the other guy. No, I got interested in open source and free software in early 2000 because I was involved in a company that was one of the early firms commercializing open source, a company called Covalent Technologies, which has since been acquired by VMware through sort of a roundabout way. But in the process of doing that, I became active in the community. This was primarily around things like Apache and projects other than Linux, and was introduced to some folks that were working on standards related to Linux, and took a job with the Free Standards Group originally. And that was...
so that was standardizing the various interfaces.
The interfaces.
On top of
there's
Linux.
a project called the Linux Standard Base, which still exists today, which essentially standardizes the interfaces that make up the core of all the major Linux distributions in the market today. And then that organization merged with another firm, which became the Linux Foundation, and since then we've merged with a couple of other open source foundations, and things have been going well. But I think I was part of something bigger than anything that I had ever predicted, which was sort of the rise of both open source software and then the need for organizations like the Linux Foundation or Mozilla Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation or the Apache Software Foundation, sort of these nonprofit entities that could essentially collaborate effectively with industry and community developers.
So you arbitrate between all the various factions so they don't kill each other.
So somewhat, that is true to some degree.
Wow, that must be a fun job. You must have arrows in your back from every single direction.
It's not bad at all. You guys here at Google get way harder time than I ever would. I'm giving away stuff, right? Wait, you guys are too. Damn it.
And pretty much the same stuff, actually.
It's all free.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for talking with us. That was really interesting.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Okay.